Good evening, everyone. My name is Brad Smith, and I want to welcome all of you to tonight's presentation called WILLA, CATHER as Creator. We're getting a little echo up here. As many of you know, WILLA, CATHER had an intimate connection to Jaffrey Center, and we are so grateful tonight to have several people who have created their own intimate connection with WILLA, CATHER. Coming from Nebraska and Kentucky, they're not local, but they'll be talking about something that's very local and dear to many of our hearts. You will get a proper introduction to our speakers in just a minute. First, I just want to go through a few things very briefly. A few thank yous. First of all, I want to thank everyone who contributes to the Amos Fortune Forum, many individual contributors, as well as some of our corporate and business donors. You may have seen their logos as you came in. They were up on the screen. Since the founding of this forum in 1946, it has been free, it has been open to all, and that's our commitment to keep it that way, and it only happens because of your generosity, so thank you very much. These beautiful flowers were sponsored by none other than my darling wife, Robin Oliver. And I want to thank Marcia Breckenridge, who is next door getting our reception ready for all of you. Everyone is invited immediately after the end of the presentation tonight to go next door to the church. You'll see the lanterns lighting your way over there. Please stop by, have some light refreshments, meet with our speakers, ask questions if you weren't able to ask at the end of the evening here, and catch up with your friends, okay? We also want you to know that you can always go to our website and sign up to get on our mailing list, learn more about the Amos Fortune Forum, about our speakers, make donations. It's hopefully a place where you can find out a lot of information. We're also live streaming now, so if you have family or friends who don't live in the area or who can't make it for some reason, you can go to our website, and it's fairly straightforward to click on a little YouTube live button, and it'll take you right to the live stream. It's also recorded, so you can watch it later at your leisure. So with that, I would like to introduce Catherine Pond, who is going to introduce our speakers for the evening.
Well, it's great to be here. I've not been in the meeting house for, I think, about 30 years. And I actually grew up in Jaffrey, so it's really nice to be here. I loved WILLA, CATHER as a young girl, but I didn't really know much about her, and I now regret not having all of those people who lived here, some of whom we talked about at dinner, who would have had those first-person stories. So if anyone knows anything about letters or stories that you heard from your grandparents, we'd love to talk to you. But I'm sure a lot of you know that it takes about 2 or 3 generations to become local in a New England town. And so my grandparents moved here in '45, right before CATHER passed. And so it was great to grow up here, but I also think WILLA, technically, Ms. CATHER qualifies for a local because she came here for over 30 years and came to the Shattuck Inn and wrote and loved Jaffrey. And she also, of course, was buried here 76 years ago. And she really loved Jaffrey. She had an affinity for it. She wrote to her friends in letters that she did her best writing here, and her letters are magnificent, and they're in many archives across the country. And I know Ashley's going to quote from some of them. And we are all here from Nebraska, from the National WILLA CATHER Center, and it's in Red Cloud where CATHER was raised. She was born in Virginia, and she also lived in New York City for 40 years and worked there with her and lived with her partner Edith Lewis. And they would spend part of the summer here, actually late summer, early fall. And we don't really know about why she was buried here. We just know that she loved this place and had an affinity for it. But I just want to read very quickly a quote from one of her letters. She wrote to Thornton Wilder, who she met at the colony, the McDowell colony, in 1926. And she says, "I truly think our town is the loveliest thing that has been produced in this country in a long, long time, and the truest. I must hear it once again before I leave for Jaffrey, New Hampshire, to spend a few weeks on Monadnock. I have been going there in the autumn for many years, and in your play I find a complete expression of everything I've ever seen and felt and become friends with in that countryside, and in all the little towns scattered about the foot of that mountain. Something enduring and resigned and gracious lies behind the details of your play, as the mountain lies behind and permeates all those little towns and farms and the lives of all those people." So with that, I want to introduce to you our friends from Nebraska, who I know have been enjoying their time very much. And thank you to the Pokornys for a lovely dinner, and to the Amos Fortune Committee for having us here. Ashley Olson, who is the executive director of the National Willa CATHER Center, she has been there for almost 15 years, I think, and director for almost 10. And she oversees the museum, arts center, and 10 historic sites, and a 612-acre prairie that make up the largest collection of any sites related to a writer in the country. We hope you visit us in Red Cloud. It's literally in the center of the United States, and we welcome you to join as members and to visit, of course. And Ashley is an extraordinary fundraiser, and she facilitated the launch of a successful campaign for the future in 2020, right before COVID, remarkably. And she has raised nearly $10 million since its inception for the organization. This grant and others have helped facilitate the restoration of our 10 historic sites, and the jewel in the crown of which is the Willa CATHER Childhood Home, and that is being restored and will reopen later this year. And she was born and raised in Red Cloud, and she has her bachelor's and master's degree in public administration from the University of Nebraska. And Littleton, who is the commission-winning sculptor of the Willa CATHER statue, which was unveiled at the US Capitol on June 7th. And he is professor of sculpture at Creighton University in Omaha, and his works are included in many public and private collections across the world. And he earned his BFA from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond and an MFA from the Maryland Institute College of Arts Reinhardt School of Sculpture in Baltimore. And his own journey in becoming a sculptor and in the creation of Willa CATHER's likeness is extraordinary. So please join me in welcoming Ashley Olson and Littleton Alston this evening.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. It really is a pleasure to be back in Jaffrey. It's been a few years since I visited, and I always enjoy spending time in a place that meant so much to Willa CATHER. Tonight, I'll offer what I hope will be an intimate glimpse into Willa CATHER and the long road she took to becoming one of America's highly regarded authors. I hope you'll learn some things you may not have known about CATHER. At a young age, she developed an appreciation for the arts, and she pushed back against some of those traditional Victorian norms. She had a successful and lucrative career as one of the leading magazine editors of her day, before leaving it all behind to focus on her writing. She's someone who very carefully honed her image as a public figure, sometimes successfully and other times not so successfully. And as Catherine mentioned, she intentionally sought out quiet and remote places to create. And before we wrap up, I'll offer a word about CATHER's legacy today and why I believe she's worthy of representation in our nation's capital. And then I will also introduce CATHER's own voice into the presentation. So I hope you'll enjoy that. I think she should tell her own story a little bit. So the CATHER family came to Nebraska in 1883 when Willa CATHER was 9 years old. It was certainly a place of pioneers and possibility, but the cultural norms of the 19th century America, of course, still reached Red Cloud. Women were expected to raise families and tend to the home, while men worked to build their social standing and their fortune. Willa CATHER no doubt understood these roles, but she didn't feel bound by them. And here she is, circa 1886 on the left, 1888 in the center, and 1890 at your right. You can see she dressed fashionably and sported a sophisticated but untraditional cropped haircut. As a teenager, CATHER planned to become a surgeon, a profession thought by many best suited for men. Her youth was spent exploring the possible self she might become in later life, whether she was accompanying a local doctor on his rounds, learning the newspaper trade, or living vicariously through dramatic performance on stage herself, as you can see her in the role of the merchant in Beauty and the Beast, or from the audience. As a teenager, CATHER embraced the new woman feminist ideal. Owning a bicycle was not only a tool for mobility, but cycling also started to redefine ideas about how girls and women were to behave, and spurred dress reform movements that fashioned clothes and undergarments to enable girls like Willa CATHER to take part in cycling. So she's pictured here with her childhood friend, Mary Minor, and her brother, Douglas. CATHER left Red Cloud in 1890. She enrolled at the university in Lincoln, and her plan to become a doctor changed after a professor published one of CATHER's essays in a local newspaper. After graduating from college in 1895, she spent a decade in Pittsburgh working as a journalist and teacher. And excerpts from correspondence written to family and friends during this time, in my mind, it's both amusing and illuminating. So while working as an editor of the Home Monthly, CATHER writes to a friend from college, Ellen Gear. And she's writing about her work at a women's magazine called the Home Monthly. She writes, "As to the magazine, Ned, I fear it will be great rot, home and fireside stuff about babies and mince pies, but the financial outlook is good. So I guess I'll stay by it for a while anyway. I will be virtually managing editor, Mr. Axtell and I being the only people who have anything to do with the literary part of it. During his month of absence, I'm to have sole charge. The proofreading goes all right. I found 4 mistakes he passed over this morning. I have a nice desk, etc. of my own. Write to me soon. Hurriedly, Willie." In addition to her work at the Home Monthly, CATHER also contributed music and drama columns to the Pittsburgh Leader and continued to write a column titled The Passing Show for the Nebraska State Journal. She was also publishing short stories in the Home Monthly and the library, among other publications. And she later settled into a role teaching Latin, composition, and algebra at Central High School in Pittsburgh. And at that time, she writes to another college friend, Dorothy Canfield Fisher. "My dearest Dorothy, the first month of teaching is at an end, and I've about decided to let someone else take up the good work for the rest of the year. I want to go home to Red Cloud and work a while. I know now that I can teach, and that better than I'd expected. But I can't help taking the matter seriously, and I doubt whether that pays in a high school where the salary means ultimate financial ruin. In 1906, CATHER relocated to New York City and became the managing editor at McClure's magazine. The publication was a leading literary and political journal known for its muckraking journalism. And just for context, between about 1900 and 1910, there were approximately 30 to 34,000 journalists in the United States, and a mere 2 to 4,000 of those were women. So about between 7 and 12% of the profession was occupied by women at the time. So CATHER was, she was part of a very small group of women journalists, and the fact that she was managing editor of one of the day's leading magazines is certainly noteworthy. It was a demanding job, though, that held CATHER back from honing her own artistic talents. During this time, she writes to friend and mentor Sarah Orne Jewett, "My dear, dear Mrs. Jewett, what Mr. McClure, who's the magazine owner, wants is to make me into a good imitation of Miss Tarbell as he can. He wants me to write articles on popular science, so-called, and other things for half of each week, and attend to the office work in the other half. That combination would be quite possible, and I fear perfectly deadening. He wants above all things good clear-cut journalism, the which I do not despise, except that I get nothing to breathe out of it and no satisfaction. Mr. McClure tells me that he does not think I will ever be able to do much at writing stories again, that I'm a good executive, and I'd better let it go at that. I sometimes, indeed, I very often think that he's right. If I've been going forward at all in the last 5 years, it has been progress of the head and not of the hand. At 34, one ought to have some sureness in their pen point and some knowledge, facility in turning out a story." In the letter preceded this one, Jewett had suggested that CATHER's editorial work was hindering her fiction writing, and she advised CATHER to focus on her life in Nebraska as subject matter for her work. A few years later, CATHER took a leave of absence from McClure's, it was 1911, and after the publication of her first novel in 1912, she left the demands of the magazine to find her own voice in her fiction. After freeing herself from magazine work, CATHER wrote steadily. Over a decade between 1913 and 1923, 5 novels were published. Her work garnered both praise and judgment from critics and inspired adoring letters from her readers. She had distinguished herself from other writers by becoming a representative voice for the settler experience on the plains. Novels like O Pioneers and My Antonia had helped shape this identity. But the year 1923 in particular was a pivotal year for Willa Cather, 100 years ago this year. On the cusp of age 50, her literature had finally been recognized with a prestigious award, the Pulitzer Prize for her novel One of Ours, a book about a Nebraska farm boy who dies on a battlefield in France during the Great War. One of Ours was published following the release of Cather's My Antonia, which had received many complimentary reviews. Cather confided to friends prior to the release of One of Ours that she feared the book was doomed. It did, in fact, receive some scathing criticism. So when Cather received news of the Pulitzer Prize in the spring of 1923, she was no doubt elated, though some of her correspondence doesn't reflect that reality. She writes to railroad executive Edwin Winter, "Dear Mr. Winter, on the 14th, a shower of cablegrams from New York apprised me of the fact that I'd been awarded the Pulitzer Prize. I was pleased, of course, and I know that you and all my friends will be pleased. What I always want, however, is lots of health and energy for the new book that's in the making, not prizes for the old. I'm glad to see One of Ours keeping up to a good pace. The writing of it was one of the most absorbing and delightful things I've ever experienced. I wonder when I shall again do a book that will grip me as that one did." Later that year, A Lost Lady was published, and Cather would soon begin to introduce new places and themes in her writing. Among other subjects, she would publish novels about a middle-aged professor's struggles to confront change, the efforts of Catholic priests to establish a diocese in New Mexico, the lives of an apothecary and his daughter in 17th century Quebec, and antebellum-era enslavement in her Virginia birthplace. In 1931, Cather's success as a writer landed her on the cover of Time magazine. She had this to say in a letter to her mother. "I'm sorry that horrible picture of me got onto the front page of the magazine called Time, but I couldn't help it. One just has to grin and bear such things. If I mourned about accidents like that and about the things jealous and disappointed newspaper men write about me, I could just mourn my life away, which I don't intend to do." When the Archbishop first came out, all the reviews were unfavorable, and many of them savage. Now those same newspapers call it a classic. Throughout her life, Cather sought quiet spaces to retreat from city life and to write. Since we're here in Jaffrey, not far from the spot where she's laid to rest, it seemed most appropriate to focus on her connection to this place. From what we can gather, Willa Cather first discovered Jaffrey around 1916, and she continued coming here until, I believe, about 1945. She visited in 1917 and 1918, working on her highly regarded and critically acclaimed novel, My Antonia, from under a tent in High Mowing. I understand the name of that property has changed, so perhaps you all know what it's referred to today. Cather chose the Shattuck Inn for her stays in Jaffrey, writing to her brother Roscoe. From her room at the inn in 1936, she says, "I'm up here alone at this hotel in the woods where I've done most of my best work and where the proprietors are so kind to me. I finished Antonia here, finished A Lost Lady, and began The Archbishop. The best part of all the better books was written here." And a few months before her death in 1947, writing to Eleanor Shattuck Osterman, Cather says, "I've never found any place where I could work in such peace and happiness as in the little rooms up in the top of the Shattuck Inn, and I've often wished I were there." The only known surviving letter to Cather's partner, Edith Lewis, was also written from the Shattuck Inn. It's a beautifully written and wonderfully touching letter. Would you like me to share it? Yeah, if that wasn't an endorsement enough. She writes, "My darling Edith, I'm sitting in your room, looking out on the woods you know so well. So far, everything delights me. I'm ashamed of my appetite for food, and as for sleep, I'd forgotten that sleeping can be an active and very strong physical pleasure. It can. It has been for all of 3 nights. I wake up now and then saturated with the pleasure of breathing clear mountain air, not cold, just chill air, of being up high with all the woods below me, sleeping too, in still white moonlight. It's a grand feeling. 1 hour from now, out of your window, I shall see a sight unparalleled, Jupiter and Venus, both shining in the golden rosy sky, and both in the west. She not very far above the horizon, and he about midway between the zenith and the silvery lady planet. From 5:30 to 6:30, they are of a superb splendor, deepening in color every second in a still daylight sky, guiltless of other stars and the moon, not up and the sun gone down behind Gap Mountain. Those 2 above in the whole vault of heaven. It lasts so about an hour, did last night. Then the lady, so silvery still, slips down into the clear rose-colored globe to be near the departed sun, and imperial Jupiter hangs there alone. He goes down about 8:30. Surely it reminds one of Dante's eternal wheels. I can't but believe that all the majesty and all that beauty, those faded and unfailing appearances and exits, are something more than mathematics and horrible temperatures. If they are not, then we are the only wonderful things, because we can wonder. I've worn my white silk suit almost constantly with no white hat, which is very awkward. By next week, it will be colder. Everything you pack carried wonderfully, not a wrinkle. And now I must dress to receive the planets, dear, as I won't wish to take the time after they appear, and they will not wait for anybody. Lovingly, W. And she ends, I do not know when I have enjoyed Jupiter so much as this summer. So earlier this year, Littleton and I had the pleasure of being part of the unveiling of the statue of CATHER in National Statuary Hall of the U.S. Capitol. CATHER is one of only 12 women represented in the collection. She's a clear and singular voice of the American experience. Her writing explores the complication of precise historical moments with themes that remain relevant to our lives today. CATHER's characters, whether at their best, their worst, or their most vulnerable, ensure that her writing will endure. And while Willa Cather stands today as the lone Pulitzer Prize winner in the National Statuary Hall collection of the U.S. Capitol, I hope what you've taken away from our time together is that above all, she was a creator of her own career, of her own persona, and of literary worlds that reach well beyond Nebraska into the depths of the human heart. So I will be happy to talk with you all about the work to keep CATHER's legacy alive today. I had just a note in this presentation about that, but I want to be mindful of time, so I think now I will welcome Littleton to talk about the incredible journey of creating a likeness of CATHER in bronze for our nation's capital.
Always something new that I learn. I just want to say that we'll start off with my being honored at to be here at the Amos Fortune. I read up on Amos's life, and as an African-American sculptor, it just touched my heart. And so it's very important to me, and I'm very proud to be here and representing that. I'll start off with the maquette. As you know, this is the winning maquette from the competition. There were around 70 artists from around the country who competed. And I was fortunate and blessed to win. When I did win, it surprised me because you always enter competitions and you hope that you would win, but you don't know if you will or not. And I was elated to receive it. And then I had done a lot of research and work just to produce the maquette, from sketches and drawings to really trying to figure out how I wanted to capture Willa and the spirit of Willa in clay and ultimately in bronze. And that was a journey in itself. I like to work, and this is me in my studio, I like to work when I'm doing a commission by filling the wall with images of the subject I'm doing, especially if it's a historic person. They no longer can be there for you, so you have to try and put together how you want to represent them from bits and pieces, from history, from photographs, from writings. I also would read her novels, but also listen to them on audiobook. And so it helped me as I was working also to be in the spirit and surrounded by Willa as I was working. The wonderful thing about it is you get to work, when you do public work, you get to work with a committee. And I had an excellent committee, and they brought to the conversation just a clean response. It's always good to have a good sounding board, like a good editor. This would be the second maquette of Willa, and what you're seeing here is a 42-inch, roughly 42-inch maquette. It's in a different clay. This is all oil-based clay. And I literally have Willa without the jacket, but she's walking through the prairie, and she has her walking stick. She also has her pen, which later will move position. But I was trying to capture the moment of inspiration. She liked to be outdoors. She liked to walk in the prairie. She liked to be in the fields. And that brought her solace and also brought together her creative spirit. And so I wanted to capture that in the gesture of her moving through the prairie. If you look carefully, you'll begin to see on the outside the beginnings of a wagon wheel, a sort of broken wagon wheel. That wagon wheel would represent the journey westward. Many people don't talk about that, but they always talk about the pioneers arriving, but there were many who died on the way. And that journey was a very difficult journey. And so that broken wagon wheel is halfway buried in the prairie. And so it really talks about all of those lives, and that journey being one which really was about the future for their families. They were trying to have a better life for their children. Now here I have the actual second maquette, and it's 7 foot. And in the background is the 42-inch maquette, and you can see that on one of the images on the far side. That gives you some idea of how a sculptor can take a maquette, the French word for sketch, and really go ahead and use that to experiment and work out ideas of composition and light and form and texture and emphasis, all of these things that are artistic concerns. And then taking in feedback from the committee's observations and feedback. If you look, the wagon wheel has been completed. And I use that as a device, not just as a metaphor, but also structurally. If you look at classical pieces, you'll see that there may be a tree trunk by the leg of a god or a goddess, and that's to help support it. But I also wanted to tie all of that together, because the base shape of the piece is actually in a rounded form like that broken wagon wheel. So it's a repeat of that motif throughout the work. Now, once the piece is done in clay and approved, because you're working with the committee and they have to say, yes, this looks wonderful, and that's really what I want, is that I am satisfied and keep my clear vision, and that they themselves also will welcome the work into their lives and to the community. So artists, especially young artists, have to be careful when they do commissions, not to give away themselves too much, but to literally work with the committee and stand where they need to be in their work. But once that's done, then it goes through the mold process and the wax process. It's a positive, negative, positive, negative, positive process. And here the bronze is being poured on one side in the ceramic shell. And then, but before that, the shells are going through the burnout kiln where the wax is melted out, hence lost wax process. Once the piece is done, and you can see there where the hot patina is put on. Now, patinas are chemical treatments on the exterior of the bronze. And if you're going outdoors, you really want to go with a fairly stable patina. But you can also experiment with color and other things, and artists do a lot of different things that sculptors have. I tend to be very traditional. I went to the Art Institute, but I also studied in France, and I did some work in Italy, and I really resonate with that process. So it's my voice. And here the tech is putting on the patina. But before the patina goes on, I go in and first I'll have it hit with a bright pad, and then I'll go in and I'll do a scrubby, which means I'll scrub back the surface. And like a painter, painting lights or darks in a form, I'm literally bringing forth the features. And then once the patina goes on, because it is a translucent process, it will reflect as I do it. So I orchestrate that composition. And you should have your hand in it. If any artist who does bronzes just leaves it, then you literally are turning over the keys to the car with the motor running, but nobody's really steering it other than the general direction. So it's very important. These are some details. This is a detail of the finished wagon wheel, for example, entering the space. And then also the committee, which I thought was appropriate, was for me to include, because it's the representative of the state of Nebraska, our state bird, the meadowlark, and also the state flower, the goldenrod. And so we have those incorporated into the side of her dress, because in the fields of Nebraska, and they have wonderful reserved fields for willows, where she was in all this environment, the grasses grow very tall. And if you look at the way in which I work the grasses, I mean, it's in the founding of our nation where we say amber waves of grain. It makes reference to like the grass is blowing like the ocean. And so you see that movement in the grass and in the piece as well. I also wanted to capture in the bronze her writings. And so I took excerpt her writing with help from Ashley and the committee and began to incorporate that into the actual piece itself and began to work the clay very thin and also began to scribe and then copy that into the actual bronze. Also on the front of the piece, I wrote her signature enlarged, which I took and blew up and scribed that into the clay as well. So that's in bronze. Now here's Willa entering Statuary Hall. And as you can see, the movers are bringing her in and we're elevating and they're bringing in the hoist and everything. And it's late in the evening, everyone's left. They've emptied the space and we're in there working. We're really thinking about, is everything going to go safely? Because we've gone so far. She's traveled all the way from Nebraska and we want to get her in safely. And that was my main priority. Here's a wonderful image of Willa in situ, and she is set between the columns there, and she's just looking out onto the space. And then the very last slide, which I'll put in, is just a shot of me with the piece, and you can see the marble base on the work. I was fortunate, and it's one of the few times you'll see both parties of the house come together, but we had both parties come in for the dedication. If you had the opportunity to see it on C-SPAN, it was fantastic. And my entire family came because I grew up in DC. And it was just a wonderful, magical time. So I thank you.
So we have time for questions, and if I know this audience, you have some questions. Just go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll see if we can direct it to the right person. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really very interesting, learning the process of how you create a sculpture. I have a question just about the statuary hall in Congress. Is there one representative from each state of a sculpture, or are there numerous representatives? And how did they come about at this time choosing CATHER to be the representative of Nebraska? As I recall, wasn't there a statue of Standing Bear once? I just have to ask about that, whether he went away or CATHER to come, or if they're both there. Okay, thank you.
So just to restate the question, we want to learn more about how many statues there might be from each state, and does one replace another, and what's sort of the current state of statuary there?
Yeah, that's a great question. two sculptures from each. Is that okay? Two sculptures from each state, and WILLA, CATHER, and Standing Bear are representing Nebraska today. That's as a result of the passage of a legislative bill by our state legislature in 2018. There was a bill introduced to replace Nebraska's current statues, which had been there, or prior statues, which had been there since the 1930s, replace those with statues of WILLA, CATHER, and Ponca Chief Standing Bear. So it was all driven sort of out of a national effort to diversify the representatives that we have in Statuary Hall and elsewhere in the Capitol. And so Ponca Chief Standing Bear is in Statuary Hall. CATHER was unveiled there and later moved to the Capitol Visitors Center. So each state has one representative in Statuary Hall proper and another representative elsewhere in the Capitol, Emancipation Hall, and other places in the Visitors Center.
Yes.
I'm not sure if this is a Jaffrey urban legend or not, but I had read that in the book about the Wisconsin farm boy in the war, that was based on a diary of our Dr.
Sweeney.
And his diary, war diary. Is that true? I mean, is that from your research?
Not a Wisconsin boy, but yes, we know one time when CATHER was visiting, she fell ill and sought out help from a local physician, Dr. Sweeney. And somehow in the course of getting to know him and him treating her for her ailment, she found out that he had been on, I believe it was a Navy ship bound for France, I suppose, during the Great War. And she found out that he'd kept a diary of his time on that ship treating the troops. I believe it was the influenza outbreak. And so he allowed her to borrow his diary, and she used some of those first-hand accounts to inform those scenes in her novel, One of Ours, where Claude Wheeler's bound for France on a Navy ship, and many of his shipmates are falling ill with influenza.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I believe the diary is here locally. I have to apologize, I don't recall if it's at the public library or maybe the Jaffrey Historical Center. I'm sure someone in the room knows better than I, but I believe at least parts of his diary are here still.
It's in our library, I believe.
It's in the library.
In the library. Somewhere in the advertising for this program, I think I read someone saying that it's unknown why she chose to be buried in the old burying ground. It is our belief that there were events related to the Shadakin and her relationship with the family there who lost children. And when she went to their funeral, she said, "This is the place I want to be." Can you confirm that?
I have heard those same stories and perhaps read them somewhere along the way, I believe. But yes, we know that after her death in 1947, Edith Lewis made her funeral arrangements and secured the plot here in the old burying ground and designed her tombstone. So whether CATHER, explicitly said somewhere along the way that this is where she wanted to be, I don't have a firsthand account of that, but it certainly makes sense given her close ties to the Ostermans and the time she spent here, and of course the death of, I believe it was their son. Is that right? Yeah.
Bob.
Both of these were extraordinary presentations. Thank you very much. And you were presenting a lot, very interesting stuff about the aesthetics of both of them. The sculpture and the pearl, and therefore this may be a little bit intolerant question. But I would like to know a little bit more about the politics foundation, so to speak, is statutory hall.
That or two, me too.
I'll start. Actually, I want to add. I think that, first off, I don't think my mic is on, is it? No. That's okay. I'll just project. They used to stand and say, and answer questions. Oh, good, you have it. Thank you. Oh, good, okay. I could easily say I won't touch that, but I would say that Nebraska is a surprising and interesting place. And by that I mean, I left Washington, D.C. after my wife and I, and we live in Nebraska and lived there for over 30 years. And I just did an interview recently with the architect of the Capitol's office, and they aired that on the internet. And I've done numerous interviews with PBS and other places. And I always say, when they ask me, well, do you consider yourself a Nebraskan, or do you consider yourself from Washington, D.C.? And jokingly, I could say a dual citizenship. But in reality, I consider myself a Nebraskan. And I think Willa went through that same transformation. She was much younger, but it allowed me the space to grow and allowed me the opportunity to breathe. And I think Nebraska has changed since Willa's time. And she couldn't wait to get out of Nebraska. But she was also trying to find her voice, and at a young age. And I had gone through all of that and had finished graduate school and all. And so I was born in Virginia as well. And so I think there's this parallel in the way she lived and how she saw creativity and how she believed in the muse and how she drove herself very hard. And so I think to insert even, we still fight over these things today, but she was strong and able to hold her own. And I sought to represent her that way. I wanted her to hold her own in Statuary Hall. I wanted you to see Willa Cather, not a woman surrounded by men with coonskin caps. And that I thought was really important. And hear from a state who had brought home Jennings Bryan and others from a different era and had put a new voice into the Capitol that spoke about artists and writers and chiefs of tribes that are still around, that still survive. The Ponca is still there. So it's forward-looking in some way and resonate and will resonate with the future. And so I think that's the best way for me to approach that question, if you want to add any more.
It's a great question, and I think a tough one to answer in a lot of ways. To the first part of your question, I'll share that CATHER, I've never looked at her as, and she wasn't particularly a political writer, though she was certainly aware of what was going on during her time. And later in her career, she was actually, she was taken to task by some critics for focusing on the past in her writing when so many, during the Great Depression, for example, when so many horrible things were happening in the present day. She was a conservative, which surprises some people when I share that. And as to the bill and the legislative process, actually, when the bill was first introduced in our state legislature, it was a bill to replace one statue with a statue of Willa Cather. And, oh no, is that better? And our Indian, maybe here, let me do this. Is that okay? Here. Do that. Maybe. Better. Should I?
Hey, Dave, can we just turn this on? And if you wouldn't mind coming
Yeah,
over, that might
that'd be
work better.
great.
Okay, is this better? All right. As to the political process for the two statues from Nebraska that are now in our U.S. Capitol, the bill was, when it was first introduced, was a bill to replace a statue of J. Sterling Morton, the founder of Arbor Day, with a statue of Willa Cather. And it was introduced at the urging of one of our Willa Cather Foundation members who really felt very strongly that there needed to be more representation of women in our state capitol, or U.S. Capitol, excuse me. And so the bill was introduced by a Democratic senator in Nebraska. And very soon after, our government affairs person called me to say, the bill's been introduced, and I got a call right away from the Indian Affairs Commission to say that they were disappointed to see it introduced because they want to introduce a bill to have Ponca Chief Standing Bear represented in the U.S. Capitol, but they were waiting a couple of years before they did so. And so after lots of conversations and a conversation between the Democratic senator that introduced the bill and the Republican senator who had planned to introduce the Standing Bear bill in the future, it was decided that the bill would be amended to include both CATHER and Ponca Chief Standing Bear. And honestly, I don't think that it would have moved through the legislative process had it not been people on both sides of the aisle advocating for new representation. So it passed. I think it wasn't unanimous. We had a couple of holdouts, but it passed with flying colors, and we were overjoyed.
Yes, here.
I went through a period of reading Willa Cather. I think I read about everything that she wrote, and this was decades ago, so I remember a lot of the details of her book, but I remember being totally entranced by her style and the way she could describe things in this economy of words. And I just wondered if you would talk a little bit more about her writing style.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that in terms of her writing style, she was very gifted at evoking a sense of place in her writing. She paints very stunning pictures of wherever it is, she's setting her fiction, whether that's the Great Plains or the desert Southwest or the Shenandoah Valley or 17th century Quebec. She is able to paint a picture in a reader's mind, which I've always really admired about Cather. And I think, there was a certain point in her career where she became very gifted at really paring things down and being succinct and direct in her work, which I think is really, really special and not something that all writers have a knack of doing. So hope that answers your question.
Did she ever write about Jaffrey or New England?
No, certainly not in any of her novels. I'm racking my brain through the short stories, and I don't know that there really isn't a lot set here in New England. She, of course, mentions this place in her letters often, but I'm going to be really embarrassed if I'm missing something, but nothing's coming to mind right offhand. I should have anticipated that question.
And I shouldn't have asked it. Yes.
Thank you for this, by the way, both of you. And this question, I think, is for both of you. I just want to get a sense. I'm hearing it a little bit. I'm certainly seeing it in the way she's being depicted in the sculpture. What are some phrases you would use to describe her personality? She's here tonight hanging out. What would you walk away with, or what would you kind of know about her personality-wise?
So the question is, how would you characterize her personality?
You go ahead.
I was afraid he would say that. Oh, I wish I knew. We talk about this in our office. Well, I'll share some things, but I will say we talk about this in our office often. And, there's widespread agreement that we all would have loved to have been in a room with Willa Cather. I often wonder if I could have held my own in a conversation with her. She was very knowledgeable, very educated person, studied Latin and Greek as a child growing up in Red Cloud. She was a vivacious reader, so I would say she was very sophisticated, certainly. From the accounts I've read, she was also very personable. She made people very comfortable when they sat down with her. And though she didn't seek out the spotlight and she really preferred to live a more private life, from everything I've read, she was certainly a very warm person, a very friendly person. So that's what I would say. I wish I had a firsthand account.
Can I just answer that from the artistic view? When you're creating a work like CATHER or any historical piece, I did George Washington Carver and Martin Luther King and all of these different notaries, notable people. What you try to do is focus in on how you want to capture their essence, their presence in a way, because that's really what you're trying to recreate. And I wanted to capture CATHER in full. That's a comment from, like Tom Wolfe, A Man in Full. Well, CATHER in full, but in a positive way. She had weathered the storm. She had become herself. And she was older, but not past her prime. And literally writing her best and receiving accolades. So there was a presence of Willa, an omnipresence of Willa. And still to this day, I think about her often. And so I think it's very powerful, and I think if you had met her, you would not forget it. And not because she would say, "Don't forget me." So I think that is how I would have seen it if she had come today. Yes.
I have a question for Littleton. I'm not from the area, but when I come, I always go to the St. Gaudens Historic Site.
Yes.
And I wondered if you've had the opportunity to go, and what sculptures have inspired you?
Good question. First off, my wife and I, and she's a painter and I'm a sculptor, and we went to St. Gaudens, and she had, we haven't had the opportunity because I'm always working. And so, but I had read his biography. I know all of his work. I know his life story. And to go and stand in his studio. And I have a large studio. I do large work. To stand in his studio was almost, it was a sense of I was on hallowed ground. I literally felt his presence in the space because as a sculptor, everything that I reach or touch or within room is in a certain position because I'm doing something or a particular thing. It's his mind. And so when I stood in the space and I saw that, the studio, I saw St. Gaudens deeper. I went to Reinhardt, the second sculpture school in the country. And it was started by Ed Riney Reinhardt, who was St. Gaudens' buddy. He's the one that convinced him to go to Paris. He said, "Those legs look like your legs." He was making the Farragut. He said, "Those legs look like your legs." And he started teasing him. And he busted up the legs and then went to Paris. So, and they all went together. So he needed a break. So St. Gaudens plays a really interesting role in my understanding of art and of sculpture in particular and of portraying lives and also seeing his Massachusetts 54th. as an African American, that is a piece that I adore. And I stood there in front of the work, the second casting, not the one on the Commons, and had seen the plaster and had seen the studies and all of that. And it resonated. Now, St. Gaudens had no way of knowing that, you know, who I would be or any of that, but I knew him. And I know his work, and I love his work. You know, I was fortunate enough too, and Ashley can attest that, and I did not know this when I applied for the commission, but I am the first African American in that permanent collection, period. Period. And that means a lot to me, but only after I was working on the piece did I find out that to be the case, and they had to research it. And when they did, it was true. And it's a testament that maybe not everything happens so quickly in our country, but we, like Dr. King said, we turn to the right side, and justice art will come full round to its position. So.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I want to thank you both very much for coming to Jaffrey and sharing some of your insights about Willa Cather and her intimate connection to this area. Thank you very much. Now, as is our tradition, something you probably won't find in Nebraska. We'd love to give you each some New Hampshire maple syrup.
Thank you.
So that is it for this evening. Please join us next door at the reception. Speak with our presenters some more and enjoy some light refreshments. And don't forget, next week is our last presentation of the summer. We'll have Jaffrey's own Jennifer Gruda, who grew up in Jaffrey and now finds herself clerking for one of the U.S. Supreme Court justices, Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think it'll be very interesting. So, and this concludes